History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 7, The End of the Europeans' World. Chapter 3, A New Asia in the Making. This reflected the second limitation of the Revolution of 1911. It provided no basis of agreement for further progress. Sun Yat-sen had said that the solution of the national question would have to precede that of the social. But even about the shape of a nationalist future, there was much disagreement, and the removal of the dynasty took away a common enemy that had delayed its emergence. Although eventually creative, the intellectual confusion marked among the revolutionaries in the first decade of the Chinese Revolution was deeply divisive and symptomatic of the huge task awaiting China's would be renovators. From 1916, a group of cultural reformers began to gather, particularly at the University of Peking. The year before, one of them, Chen Tu-Su, had founded a journal called New Youth, which was the focus of the debate they ignited. Chen preached to Chinese youth, in whose hands he believed the revolution's destiny to lie, a total rejection of the old Chinese cultural tradition. Like other intellectuals who talked of Huxley and Dewey and introduced their bemused compatriots to the works of the Ibsen, Chen still thought the key lay in the West, in its Darwinian sense of struggle, its individualism and utilitarianism. It still seemed to offer a way ahead. But important though such leadership was, and enthusiastic though its disciples might be, an emphasis on a Western re education for China was a handicap. Not only were many educated and patriotic Chinese sincerely attached to the traditional culture, but Western ideas were only sure of a ready welcome among the most untypical elements in the Chinese society, the seaboard city dwelling merchants and their student offsprings, often educated abroad. The mass of Chinese could hardly be touched by such ideas and appeals, and the demand of other reformers for a vernacular literature was one evidence of this fact. Insofar as they were touched by nationalist feeling, the Chinese were likely to turn against the West and against the Western inspired capitalism, which for many of them meant one more kind of exploitation and was the most obvious constituent of the civilization some modernizers urged them to adopt. But for the most part, China's peasant masses seemed, after 1911, relapsed in passivity, apparently unmoved by events and unaware of the agitation of angry and westernized young men. It is not easy to generalize about their economic state. China was too big and too varied. But it seems clear that while the population steadily increased, nothing was done to meet the peasants' hunger for land. Instead, the number of the indebted and landless grew, their wretched lives frequently made even more intolerable by war, whether directly or through its concomitants, famine and disease. The Chinese Revolution would only be assured success when it could activate these people, and the cultural emphasis of the reformers sometimes masked an unwillingness to envisage the practical political steps necessary for this. China's weakness remained Japan's opportunity. A world war was the occasion to push forward again her 19th century ambitions. The advantages offered by the Europeans' quarrels with one another could be exploited. Japan's allies could hardly object to her seizure of the German ports in China. Even if they did, they could do nothing about it while they needed Japanese ships and manufactures. There was always the hope, too, that the Japanese might send their own army to Europe to fight, though nothing like this happened. Instead, the Japanese finessed by arousing fears that they might make a separate peace with the Germans and pressed ahead in China. At the beginning of 1915, the Japanese government presented to the Chinese government a list of 21 demands and an ultimatum. In effect, this amounted to a proposal for a Japanese protectorate over China. The United Kingdom and the United States did what diplomacy could do to have the demands reduced, but in the end, the Japanese got much of what they asked for, as well as further confirmation of their special commercial and leasehold rights in Manchuria. Chinese patriots were enraged, but there was nothing they could do at the moment when their internal politics were in disorder. They were so confused indeed that Sun Yat sen was himself at this moment seeking Japanese support. The next intervention came in 1916 when the Japanese pressure was brought to bear on the British to dissuade them from approving Yuan Shikai's attempt to restore stability by making himself emperor. In the following year came another treaty, this time extending the recognition of Japan's special interests as far as Inner Mongolia. In August 1917, the Chinese government went to war with Germany, partly in the hope of winning goodwill and support which would ensure her an independent voice at the peace, but only a few months later the United States formally recognized the special interests of Japan in China in return for endorsement of the principle of the open door and a promise to maintain Chinese integrity and independence. All that the Chinese had got from the Allies was the ending of the German and Austrian extraterritoriality and the concession that payment of Boxer indemnities to the Allies should be delayed. The Japanese, moreover, secured more concessions from China in secret agreements in 1917 and 1918. Yet, when the peace came, it deeply disappointed Chinese and Japanese alike. Japan was now indisputably a world power. It had in 1918 the third largest navy in the world. It was true too that it won solid gains at the peace. It retained the former German rights in Shantung, promised by the British and French in 1917, was granted a mandate over many of the former German Pacific islands and a permanent seat on the Council of the League of Nations. But the gain in face implied in such recognition was offset in Asian eyes by a failure to have a declaration in favor of racial equality written into the covenant of the League. On this line, the only one on which Japanese and Chinese stood shoulder to shoulder at Paris, Woodrow Wilson rejected a majority vote, ruling that approval should be unanimous. With the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand against it, it fell by the wayside. The Chinese had much to feel aggrieved about, too, for in spite of the widespread sympathy over the 21 demands, notably in the United States, they were unable to obtain a reversal of the Shantung decision. Disappointed of American diplomatic support and crippled by the divisions within their own delegation between the representatives of the Peking government and those of the Kuomintang at Canton, the Chinese refused to sign the treaty. An almost immediate consequence was an upheaval in China to which some commentators have given an importance as great as that of the 1911 revolution itself. This was the May 4th movement of 1919. It stemmed from a student demonstration in Peking against the peace, which had been planned for 7th May, the anniversary of China's acceptance of the 1915 demands, but was brought forward to anticipate action by the authorities. It escalated, although at first only into a small riot and the resignation of the head of the university. This then led to a nationwide student movement, one of the first political reflections of the widely spread establishment in China of new colleges and universities after 1911. This in turn spread to embrace others than students and to manifest itself in strikes and a boycott of the Japanese goods. A movement which had begun with intellectuals and their pupils spread to include other city dwellers, notably industrial workers and the new Chinese capitalists who had benefited from the war. It was the most important evidence yet seen of the mounting rejection of Europe by Asia. For the first time, an industrial China entered the scene. China, like Japan, had enjoyed an economic boom during the war, though a decline in European imports to China had been partly offset by increased Japanese and American sales. Chinese entrepreneurs in the ports had found it profitable to invest in production for the home market. The first important industrial areas outside Manchuria began to appear. They belonged to progressive capitalists who sympathized with revolutionary ideas, all the more when the return of peace brought renewed Western competition, and evidence that China had not earned her liberation from tutelage to the foreigner. The workers too felt this resentment. Their jobs were threatened. Many of them were first generation town dwellers drawn into the new industrial areas from the countryside by the promise of employment. And any uprooting from the tenacious soil of peasant tradition was even more important in China than in ancient regime Europe. Family and village ties were even stronger in China. The migrant to the town left behind patriarchal authority and the reciprocal obligations of the independent producing unit, the household. This was a further great weakening of the age old structure, which had survived the revolution and still tied China to the past. New material was thus made available for new ideological deployments. The May 4th movement first showed what could be made of such forces as these by creating the first broadly based Chinese revolutionary coalition. Progressive Western liberalism had not been enough. Implicit in the movement's success was the disappointment of the hopes of many of the cultural reformers. Capitalist Western democracy had been shown up by the Chinese government's helplessness in the face of Japan. Now, that government faced another humiliation from its own subjects. The boycott and demonstration forced it to release the arrested students and dismiss its pro Japanese ministers. But this was not the only important consequence of the May 4th movement. For all their limited political influence, reformers had, for the first time, thanks to the students, broken through into the world of social action. This aroused enormous optimism and greater popular political awareness than ever before. This is the case for saying that contemporary Chinese history begins positively in 1919 rather than 1911. Yet, ultimately, the explosion had come because of an Asian force, Japanese ambition. That force, not in itself a new one in China's affairs, was by 1919 operating on a China whose cultural tradition was dissolving fast. The ending of the examination system, the return of the westernized exiles, and the great literary and cultural debate of the war years had all pushed things too far for any to the old stable state. The warlords could provide no new authority to identify and sustain orthodoxy. And now, even the great rival of the Confucian past, Western liberalism, was under attack because of its association with the exploiting foreigner. Western liberalism had never had mass appeal. Now, its charm for intellectuals was threatened just as another rival ideological force from the West had appeared on the scene. The Bolshevik Revolution gave Marxism a homeland to which its adherents abroad could look for inspiration and guidance, leadership, and sometimes material support. A great new factor was thus now introduced into an already dissolving historical epoch, and one bound to accelerate its end. Both the February 1917 revolution and the Bolshevik victory had been warmly welcomed by one of the contributors to New Youth, Li Tachao, who was from 1918, a librarian at Peking University. Soon he came to see in Marxism the motive force of world revolution and the means to vitalize the Chinese peasantry. At that moment of disillusion with the West, Russia was very popular among Chinese students. It seemed that the successors of the Tsar had driven out the old imperialist Adam, for one of the first acts of the Soviet government had been a formal renunciation of all extraterritorial rights and the jurisdictions enjoyed by the Tsarist state. In the eyes of the nationalists, Russia therefore had clean hands. Moreover, her revolution, a revolution in a great peasant society, claimed to be built upon a doctrine whose applicability to China seemed specially plausible in the wake of the industrialization provoked by the war. In 1918, there had begun to meet at Peking University a Marxist study society of whose members some had been prominent in the May 4th movement. One of them was an assistant in the university library, Mao Zedong. By 1920, Marxist texts were beginning to appear in student magazines, and in that year, the first complete Chinese translation of the Communist Manifesto appeared. Now, too, the first attempts were made to deploy Marxist and Leninist principles by organizing strikes in support of the May 4th movement. Yet, Marxism opened divisions between the reformers. Chen Tuxiu himself turned to it as a solution for China's problem in 1920. He threw his energies into helping to organize the emerging Chinese left around Marxism. The liberals were beginning to be left behind. The Comintern observed its opportunities and had sent its first man to China in 1919 to help Chen and Li Tachao. The effects were not entirely happy. There were quarrels. Nevertheless, in circumstances still obscure, we know precisely neither names nor dates, a Chinese Communist Party was formed in Shanghai in 1921 by delegates from different parts of China, Mao Zedong among them. So began the last stage of the Chinese Revolution and the latest twist of that curious dialectic which has run through the relations of Europe and Asia. Once more, an alien Western idea, Marxism, born and shaped in a society totally unlike the traditional societies of the East, embodying a background of assumptions whose origins were rooted in Judeo Christian culture, was taken up by an Asian people and put to their use. It was to be deployed not merely against the traditional sources of inertia in China, in the name of the Western goals of modernization, efficiency, and universal human dignity and equality, but against the source from which it too came, the European world. Communism benefited enormously in China from the fact that capitalism could easily be represented as the unifying connecting principle behind foreign exploitation and aggression. In the 1920s, China's divisions were thought to make it of little account in international affairs, though nine powers with Asiatic interests were got to guarantee its territorial integrity, and Japan agreed to hand back former German territories in China, which it had taken in the Great War. This was part of a complicated set of agreements made at Washington, whose core was the international limitation of naval strength. There was great uneasiness about the cost of armaments. These, in the end, left Japan relatively stronger. The four major powers guaranteed one another's possessions too, and thus provided a decent burial for the Anglo-Japanese alliance, whose ending had long been sought by the Americans. But the guarantee to China, everyone knew, was worth no more than the preparedness of the Americans to fight to support it. The British had been obliged by the treaties not to build a naval base at Hong Kong. Meanwhile, foreigners continued to administer the customs and tax revenues on which the Peking government of an independent China depended, and foreign agents and businessmen dealt directly with the warlords when it suited them. Though American policy had further weakened the European position in China, this was not apparent in China. The apparently continuing grip of the foreign devils on China's life was one reason why Marxism appealed to intellectuals, went far beyond the boundaries of the formal structure of the Chinese Communist Party. Sun Yat-sen stressed his doctrinal disagreement with it, but adopted views which helped to carry the KMT away from conventional liberalism and in the direction of Marxism. In his view of the world, Russia, Germany, and Asia had a common interest as exploited powers against their oppressors and enemies. The four imperialist powers. Germany was well regarded after it had undertaken in 1921 to place its relations with China on a completely equal footing. He coined a new expression, hypocolony, for the state of affairs in which China was exploited without formal subordination as a dependency. His conclusion was collectivist. On no account must we give more liberty to the individual, he wrote. Let us secure liberty instead for the nation. This was to give new endorsement to the absence of individual liberty, which had always been present in the classical Chinese outlook and tradition. The claims of family, clan, and state had always been paramount, and Sun Yat sen envisaged a period of one party rule in order to make possible mass indoctrination, to reconfirm an attitude which had been in danger of corruption by Western ideas. There was apparent then no grave obstacle to the cooperation of the Chinese Communist Party and the KMT. The behavior of the Western powers and of the warlords provided common enemies, and the Russian government helped to bring them together. Cooperation with the anti-imperialist power with which China had its longest land frontier seemed at least prudent and potentially very advantageous. The policy of the Comintern, for its part, favored cooperation with the KMT to safeguard Russian interests in Mongolia and as a step towards holding off Japan. The USSR had been left out of the Washington conferences, though no power had greater territorial interests in Asia. For her, cooperation with the likely winners in China was an obvious course, even if Marxist doctrine had not also fitted such policy. From 1924 onwards, the CCP was working with the KMT under Soviet patronage, in spite of some doubts among Chinese communists. As individuals, though not as a party, they could belong to the KMT. Sun Yat sen's able young soldier, Chiang Kai shek, was sent to Moscow for training, and a military academy was founded in China to provide ideological as well as military instruction. In 1925, Sun Yat sen died. He had made communist cooperation with his followers easier, and the United Front still endured. Sun Yat sen's will, which Chinese school children learnt by heart, had said that the revolution was not yet complete, and while the communists made important advances in winning peasant support for the revolution in certain provinces, the new revolutionary army, led by idealistic young officers, made headway against the warlords. By 1927, something of a semblance of unity had been restored to the country under the leadership of the KMT. Anti-imperialist feeling supported a successful boycott of British goods, which led the British government, alarmed by the evidence of growing Russian influence in China, to surrender its concessions at Hankow and Kaohsiung. It had already promised to return Wei Hanwei to China 1922, and the United States had renounced its share of the Boxer indemnity. Such successes added to signs that China was on the move at last. One important aspect of this revolution long went unremarked. Theoretical Marxism stressed the indispensable revolutionary role of the industrial proletariat. The Chinese communists were proud of the progress they had made in politicizing the new urban workers, but the mass of Chinese were peasants, still trapped in the Malthusian vice of rising numbers and land shortage. Their centuries of suffering were, if anything, intensified by the breakdown of central authority in the warlord years. Some Chinese communists saw in the peasants a revolutionary potential which, if not easy to reconcile with contemporary Marxist orthodoxy, as relied by Moscow theorists, nonetheless embodied Chinese reality. One of them was Mao Zedong. He and those who agreed with him turned their attention away from the cities to the countrysides in the early 1920s and began an unprecedented effort to win over the rural masses to communism. Paradoxically, Mao seems to have continued to cooperate with the Kuomintang longer than other Chinese communists just because it was more sympathetic to the organization of the peasants than was his own party. A great success followed. It was especially marked in Hunan. But altogether, some 10 million or so peasants and their families were, by 1927, organized by the communists. In a few months, wrote Mao, the peasants have accomplished what Dr. Sun Yat sen wanted, but failed to accomplish in 40 years he devoted to the national revolution. Organization made possible the removal of many of the ills that beset the peasants. Landlords were not dispossessed, but their rents were often reduced. Usurious rates of interests were brought down to reasonable levels. Rural revolution had eluded all previous progressive movements in China, and this was identified by Mao as the key shortcoming of the 1911 revolution. The communist success in reaching this goal was based on the discovery that it could be brought about by using the revolutionary potential of the peasants themselves. This had enormous significance for the future, for it implied new possibilities of historical development throughout Asia. Mao grasped this. If we allot 10 points to the democratic revolution, he wrote, then the achievements of the urban dwellers and the military unit rates only 3 points, while the remaining 7 points should go to the peasants in their rural revolution. In an image twice repeated in the report on the Hunan movement, he compared the peasants to an elemental force. The attack is just like a tempest or hurricane. Those who submit to it will survive. Those who resist perish. This image was significant. Here was something rooted deeply in Chinese tradition and the long struggle against the landlords and bandits. If the communists tried hard to set aside tradition by eradicating superstition and breaking family authority, they nevertheless drew upon it too. Communism's rural lodgment was the key to its survival in the crisis which overtook its relations with the KMT after Sun Yat-sen's death. Sun's removal permitted a rift to open in the KMT between a left and a right wing. The young Chiang, who was now seen as a progressive, now emerged as the military representative of the right, which reflected mainly the interests of the capitalists and indirectly the landlords. Differences within the KMT over strategy were resolved when Chiang confident of his control of the troops, committed them to destroying the left factions and the Communist Party's organization in the cities. This was accomplished with much bloodshed in Shanghai and Nanking in 1927 under the eyes of the contingents of European and American soldiers who had been sent to China to protect the concessions. The CCP was proscribed, but this was not quite the end of its cooperation with the KMT, which continued in a few areas for some months, largely because of Russian unwillingness to break with Chiang. This had already made easier the destruction of the city communists. The Comintern in China, as elsewhere, myopically pursued what were believed to be Russian interests, refracted through the mirror of dogmatic Marxism. These interests were, for Stalin, in the first place domestic. In external affairs, he wanted someone in China who could stand up to the British, the greatest imperialist power, and the KMT seemed the best bet for that. Theory fitted these choices. The bourgeois revolution had to precede the proletarian according to the Marxist orthodoxy. Only after the triumph of the KMT was clear did the Russians withdraw their advisors from the CCP, which gave up open politics to become a subversive underground organization.